Wow. Okay. So this one that you guys sent in, this is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We're going way back to 2003, the case of 8-year-old Terrance Cottrell Jr., who died during an exorcism.
It's going to be a tough one, but really important, I think.
Definitely. I mean, talk about a story that just forces you to confront these big questions, about faith and mental health and the law. We're going to do a real deep dive here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what makes this case so fascinating is that it raises questions that are relevant to everyone, whether you're religious or not. How do we as a society understand behavior that we might perceive as different or outside the norm? And how do those understandings, or sometimes misunderstandings, impact vulnerable people?
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What do we actually know about what happened to Terrance?
Right. So it was August 22nd, 2003 at the Faith Temple Church of Apostolic Faith in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And from the sources that you provided, it seems that the church community, and Reverend Ray Hemphill in particular, believed that Terrance was possessed by demons. So they decided to perform an exorcism ritual.
And what did that look like? What actually happened during this exorcism?
So according to reports, Terrance was restrained, he was wrapped in sheets, and Reverend Hemphill actually laid across his chest.
Oh my gosh.
To try to literally expel these supposed demons.
I mean, this sounds incredibly dangerous, even if you did believe in possession.
Yeah, and tragically, after about 2 hours of this ritual, Terrance died.
It's awful. The official cause of death was listed as mechanical asphyxia due to external chest compression. I'm not a doctor. What does that actually mean?
Well, in simple terms, it means that he suffocated. The pressure on his chest from Reverend Hemphill lying on top of him prevented him from breathing.
So heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the whole concept of exorcism.
Right.
I mean, how does someone even decide that a person is possessed in the first place?
Well, belief in demonic possession has been around for centuries in different cultures and religions.
Wow.
And there are all sorts of beliefs about it, but some common warning signs that people often point to include things like frightening facial expressions or threatening gestures. Maybe the person speaking in tongues or seems to have a completely different personality.
Yeah, but couldn't some of those things also be symptoms of a mental illness or even just, being a kid?
Exactly. That's the really tricky part. How do you distinguish between something that might have a spiritual explanation and something that could be explained by science or medicine?
Right. And, in Terrance's case, the sources mentioned that he had actually been diagnosed with autism.
That's right.
So think about it. I mean, many of the behaviors associated with autism, like difficulty with communication or having a meltdown because of sensory overload, those could easily be misinterpreted, especially if you're already looking for a supernatural explanation.
Absolutely. And historically, there have been so many instances where conditions that we now recognize as mental illnesses were attributed to demonic influence. I mean, we're talking epilepsy, schizophrenia, even just plain old anxiety.
Wow. So this case is really a tragic example of how that kind of thinking can persist even today.
It is, and unfortunately can have really devastating consequences, as we see with Terrance.
And it makes you wonder about the qualifications of the person performing the exorcism. In Reverend Hemphill's case, he didn't have any formal religious training. He was ordained by his own brother.
Yeah, that's right. And before that, he worked as a maintenance man.
A maintenance man. So he had no expertise in mental health, no theological background. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really raises questions about accountability and, who should have the authority to perform these kinds of rituals.
Right, because, in the Catholic Church, for instance, exorcisms are taken very seriously. They have a very specific protocol involving trained priests, psychological evaluations.
Exactly. They don't just jump into it.
But clearly that's not the case with every religious group.
No, and I think that's part of the problem. There's often a lack of oversight. And, when you're dealing with something as sensitive as potential demonic possession, you need safeguards in place.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when it came to the legal ramifications of Terrance's death, what was the outcome of this trial?
Well, Hemphill was actually convicted of child abuse, but not murder.
Really?
Yeah. It seems like the prosecutors felt it would be very difficult to prove intent for a murder charge.
But how could that be? I mean, the outcome was so clearly the result of his actions.
Right. But proving intent, especially in a situation where someone genuinely believes they're doing the right thing, even if it's completely misguided, can be really challenging legally.
I guess so. So what was Hemphill's sentence for child abuse?
He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, followed by 7.5 years of state supervision. He also had to pay over $1,200 in restitution to Terrance's family and was banned from performing any more exorcisms without extensive training.
I mean, that just seems so inadequate considering what happened.
Yeah, it does make you think about how our legal system deals with these kinds of complex cases where faith and mental health intersect.
This whole story brings up so many ethical questions. How do we balance religious freedom with the need to protect vulnerable people from harm? How can we better educate communities, especially faith communities, about mental health?
I think those are some of the most important questions we can be asking ourselves right now. We need to have these conversations even if they're difficult. Because tragically, Terrance's story isn't unique. There are countless other examples where a lack of understanding about mental health has led to really harmful, even deadly consequences.
It's a sobering reminder to approach situations like this with a critical eye and to, always seek professional help when we're dealing with issues that are outside our expertise.
Especially when it comes to mental health. We can't rely on faith alone. We need science and reason, too.
Well said. I think the big takeaway for me from this deep dive is the need for balance. We have to find a way to bridge the gap between faith and reason to create a more inclusive and understanding world.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's about finding that middle ground where everyone feels safe and supported.
It's something we all need to be thinking about and working towards. Thanks for walking us through this tough case. I think it's given us all a lot to consider.
You're welcome.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into such a difficult and important topic.
And keep those source requests coming.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Until then.